Welcome to Talk 34 in our series where I'm reflecting on God's goodness to me throughout my life. Last time I was mentioning some of the health challenges I faced in India, and today I'll be describing how these continued for some time once we were back in England. I will also be talking about the serious health challenges Eileen faced during the last 10 years of her life. I take no pleasure in recording all this, but an honest account of my life must include the hard times as well as the good, and of course, the Lord has brought me through. Challenges following India then. Fortunately, there was little in my diary for the first few weeks after our return from India, and I soon began to feel better. I thought I was back to normal, and in April we set off for 2 weekends of ministry in Essex. We would stay with Eileen's sister Joan in Billericay, and the first weekend I would preach in Witham, and a week later in our old church in Colchester. On the first Saturday, we drove from our home in Paynton straight to Witham, a journey of about 250 miles, and I preached in the afternoon and evening meetings. We then made our way to Billericay, returning to Witham for the Sunday morning service. I felt fine on the Saturday, but on Sunday I suddenly started to feel unwell again shortly before I was due to preach. The symptoms were like those I had had in India, and I went outside to get some fresh air. However, I managed to get through the preaching, but was grateful to get back to Billericay. The next day, Joan arranged an appointment for me with her GP, who, hearing that I'd been bitten by a mosquito in India and suspecting that I might have malaria, sent me for tests at the hospital in Basildon. Although these tested negative, I was still worried that there was something seriously wrong with me and just wanted to get back home to Paynton. Apologising profusely, I asked our friends at Colchester to release me from my commitment to preach the following weekend, and we drove home later that week, unsure of what the future might hold. The next 2 years proved to be extremely difficult. I continued to experience similar problems every time I preached. In May 2010, I drove up to Huddersfield for the AOG conference, but was so stressed that I returned home without attending a meeting. I immediately arranged for an appointment with my GP, Mark Thompson, a good Christian man, and told him my whole story. He reminded me that as Christians we're not immune to such things, and recommended some books that might help explain my condition. It appears that my experience in India, caused by extreme heat, dehydration and overwork, triggered a rush of adrenaline which produced the symptoms I was struggling with. I learnt that worrying about the symptoms only made matters worse because that causes a further rush of adrenaline. I was caught in a vicious circle, and the only way out was to embrace the symptoms, tell myself that they would not harm me, and gradually I would get better. And that's what happened, although it did take a long time. Following my visit to the doctor, I cancelled my 2-week trip to teach at the Bible College in Finland in May. We did go to Madeira for a 3-week holiday in June, but this turned out to be disappointing because of my recurring symptoms. However, in September, I did manage to teach for 2 weeks at Mattersey, preach for a weekend in Pocklington, and, assisted by Bob Hyde, teach a course at CTS in Brussels for a week. I was still experiencing the symptoms, but managing to cope with them, at least most of the time. But there were still occasions when I felt unable to preach. In October, I cancelled a weekend in Paynton, and in November, I was unable to complete a weekend's ministry in Aston. I began to wonder if the time had come for me to give up. But less than 2 weeks later, the Lord suddenly intervened. Eileen and I were in Exeter at a meeting for Assemblies of God ministers and their wives. The guest preacher was John Glass, the General Superintendent of the Elim churches. He was preaching on Jeremiah 1 when he came to verses 11 and 12. The word of the Lord came to me. What do you see, Jeremiah? I see the branch of an almond tree, I replied. The Lord said to me, you have seen correctly, for I am watching to see that my word is fulfilled. He explained the play on words which we find in these verses. The Hebrew word for almond is very similar to the word for watch. The almond tree is among the first to blossom in spring. It's something you watch for as a sign that spring has come. Winter will be followed by spring because God watches over his word to see that it is fulfilled. Now, in England, most of us don't see an almond tree too often, so John likened it to crocuses. In his garden, they're the first flowers to bloom in spring. They're the sign or guarantee that winter won't be forever. And then John broke away from his notes and said something like this. There are some of you here who are feeling that your ministry has come to an end. You've been experiencing a bleak winter, but the Lord wants you to know that it will not be forever. You will experience a new springtime. Eileen and I looked at each other. Was this for us? Surely it must be. But there were a lot of other people in that meeting. Could it be that John's prophetic word was for them and not for us? We drove home after the meeting, hoping, rather than believing, that this really was a word from the Lord for us. And then, that very evening, Jill Cooper, one of our friends from church, arrived on our doorstep and said, I brought you a little present. To be honest, I had bought it for someone else, but then I felt the Lord tell me to give it to you instead. What was the present? A bowl of crocuses. How good God is. He gave us the assurance that I would emerge from this dark period of winter into a new springtime of ministry. We sometimes have to go through a valley of shadow, but he is with us in it all the way. So in 2011, whenever the symptoms reoccurred, I pressed through them, knowing that this condition wouldn't last forever. In March, I flew to Scotland to speak to the AOG ministers. In May, we went back to Finland to teach at Issakiria for 2 weeks. In September, I taught for 2 weeks at Mattersey, and in October, I was back at CTS again. None of these occasions was easy. In fact, I often felt really unwell. But everyone always said that if I hadn't told them, they wouldn't have known anything was wrong with me. I'm not quite sure how much longer it took to get back to normal. In fact, I'm not really sure what normal is. We all deteriorate physically as we get older, and our energy levels are not what they were. When I look back at what I was doing in the years before Mattersey and throughout my time there, I wonder how I possibly managed it, all of it. Managed it all, I should say. What was normal for me then is far beyond my capabilities now. But I've moved into a new springtime in my ministry, and people tell me that at 87, I'm not doing badly for my age, for which I'm grateful. But my challenges were nothing compared with those faced by Eileen in the last 10 years of her life. On Sunday the 21st of December 2014, quite unexpectedly, at about 9 a.m, Eileen started to experience severe pain in her stomach as she was getting ready for church. As the pain was unrelenting, causing Eileen to pass out a couple of times, by 3 p.m. I decided I needed to call 999. I accompanied Eileen in the ambulance while Jonathan followed by car. After waiting with her a few hours, John and I were advised to go home and await the results of an MRI scan. At about 10:30 that evening, the surgeon phoned to ask us to go to discuss options for Eileen. It was clear that the situation was very serious. On arrival at the hospital, we were told that the scan had revealed that the blood supply had been cut off from Eileen's bowel and that her smaller bowel had died. Without an immediate operation, she would die. There was even the possibility that the condition was already too far advanced for them to be able to save her. Furthermore, even if they were able to save her, there was a strong possibility that she would need to have a permanent colostomy. Eileen agreed with us that we should agree to the operation and trust God for the best possible outcome. We prayed with her, of course, but as you can imagine, for the next few hours we were on an emotional roller coaster, experiencing all the ups and downs from fear to faith, but with a determination to trust God come what may. We simply could not believe that it was God's time for Eileen to go to heaven and kept praying that he would spare her. Imagine our relief when at 1 o'clock on Monday morning, the surgeon phoned to say that she had the best possible news for us. Eileen's bowel was alive. What had been causing the pain was an internal hernia which they had been able to fix. None of her bowel had needed to be removed, and the blood supply had been restored. Now, bearing in mind the certainty with which the surgeon told us that Eileen's bowel had died, we were convinced that this was not just a case of a faulty diagnosis, but that God had worked an amazing miracle in restoring Eileen's bowel to life. God had allowed man to do what he could, but intervene to do what man could not do, restore a dead bowel to life. We were so grateful for the prayers of the many people who interceded for Eileen throughout this difficult time, and to God for his miraculous intervention. I never cease to be amazed at his wonderful grace and goodness to us. But the operation had been very invasive and left Eileen severely weakened for months. And she never fully regained the strength and energy she had lost. But that, of course, may have been partly caused by the fact that she wasn't getting any younger. And neither was I. In April 2015, we had a few days' break in the Lake District, and neither of us felt like walking very far. It was much the same in September when we went to the Isle of Wight, but on both these occasions, we contented ourselves with driving around in the car, visiting old haunts, marvelling at the beauty of God's creation, and, of course, enjoying the food. We planned 2 short holidays for 2016. The first in Longtown, a village in Herefordshire, close to the Welsh border, in May. After preaching in Rugby on the Sunday morning, we drove there in the afternoon and spent a few delightful days in a charming cottage on the banks of the River Monnow, returning to Brixham the following weekend. The second holiday, planned for a week in September at the southern end of Coniston Water, never happened. In June, I flew to Ireland to preach for a weekend in Sligo, where Daniel Caldwell, one of our former students, was leading a church. On Sunday morning, I preached on Jesus calming the storm in Matthew 8, and I remember saying that sometimes unexpected problems suddenly arise in our lives, but Jesus is well able to see us through them and get us to the other side. Who knows what might happen this week? But whatever happens, Jesus is with us. And I flew home that afternoon. I have preached that message many times, but little did I know what was to happen just 2 weeks later. Just 2 days later. On Tuesday evening, sitting in her armchair, Eileen had a severe stroke and was rushed into Torbay Hospital. From head to toe, she had no feeling down the right side of her body. The next Sunday, still in hospital, she suffered another stroke, and we were told that the outlook was extremely bleak. She was rushed to Derryford Hospital in Plymouth and underwent surgery to relieve the pressure on her brain. Her life had been saved. After 11 days, she was transferred back to Torbay, where she remained for 8 days until a bed was available at Newton Abbot, where she began a course of rehab. Throughout this time, we were all looking to the Lord for a complete healing, whether instantaneous or gradual, but her progress was extremely slow, and it was becoming increasingly clear that she needed a miracle if she would ever walk again. And although the healing miracle we were praying for never happened, we could see the hand of the Lord at work in other ways. Firstly, on July the 28th, when we were sitting in the hospital day room and eating cake to celebrate our wedding anniversary, the Torbay doctor, who told us that the outlook was extremely bleak, approached us and said, I'm looking for Eileen Petts. And when he saw her, he said, I can't believe it, which was something he repeated more than once during the 15 minutes he was with us. He clearly had not expected Eileen to survive, and this encouraged our faith that God was at work in the situation. On the 10th of August, after 8 weeks in 3 different hospitals, Eileen finally came home, and that in itself was a miracle. We had been told just a few days earlier that Eileen would have to be discharged as her bed was needed for someone else. To continue her rehab, she could either go into a care home if we could find one that would take her, or the NHS would provide rehab workers to come to our home, but we would need to find a home care company to take care of Eileen's other needs. The problem was that at that time there were over 70 people in Torbay on a waiting list. I needed an answer. Quick. And just in time, the answer came. Just a day before Eileen had to be discharged, Trudy Hyde came to me and said that she and her twin sister Sylvia would take care of Eileen if we would like them to. How wonderful! I didn't need to ask Eileen because I knew she would love it. For the sake of all concerned, I felt I needed to ask the Lord for his guidance. And I did foresee one possible problem. I didn't know if I would be allowed to choose Eileen's carers, or if they would require certain recognised medical qualifications. I needed an immediate answer to that question, and I didn't know where to find it. I was just going off to visit Eileen, and I didn't want to mention the twins' kind offer until I knew the answer, in case it led to her being disappointed. And then I remembered that Katie, the daughter of our next-door neighbour, Sue, was the lead carer for the whole of Torbay. She would certainly know the answer. I was just about to go and knock on Sue's door when I changed my mind and said, Lord, if this is of you, before I get into the car, please let Sue come out without me knocking on her door. And that is what happened. No sooner had I prayed that prayer than Sue came out of her house. In less than 5 minutes, Katie was on the phone to me and told me that I could choose whomever I liked. Eileen was overjoyed, and Trude and Sylvia took care of her visiting our home 4 times a day for the next 4 years, until we moved to a bungalow on the other side of town, when workers from Abide Care, Brixham, took over. Eileen finally went to be with the Lord in February 2024, almost 8 years after that awful stroke. She was always grateful that her condition was not physically painful, but frustrated at her inability to walk and do all those things we normally take for granted. And we both naturally wondered why the Lord had allowed this to happen. One Bible passage that Eileen found particularly helpful was 2 Corinthians 1, verses 3 to 5. There the Apostle Paul says, "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves have received from God. For just as the sufferings of Christ flow over into our lives, so also, through Christ, our comfort overflows." And the comfort and strength our Father gave to Eileen certainly did overflow to others, not least as a testimony to the dozens of carers from Abide who came into our home over the final 4 years of her life. Throughout this whole very difficult period, both Eileen and I had been sustained by our Christian faith and by a particular word received from the Lord through Barry Taylor, our daughter Sarah's father-in-law. Barry and Sandra live some distance away, and we normally only saw them once or twice a year. On one such occasion, when Eileen seemed to be making little progress after her stroke, we were all having a meal together at Berryhead Hotel, when Barry said the Lord had given him a word for us. "My Father is at work in your lives and situation, which he is using as a platform to display his sustaining grace." God sometimes uses amazing miracles of healing to display his power and love, but it's often the sustaining grace that he gives his people in times of suffering that brings others to faith. Through Eileen's suffering, the lives of many were touched, people who might never have otherwise heard the good news about Jesus. And since she died, there have been many opportunities to share the gospel. The funeral staff at the crematorium were visibly moved and said they'd never experienced a service like it. And neighbours said the same thing about the church service that followed it. As Christians, we know where we're going, and the knowledge that our loved ones are with the Lord is a source of great comfort and even joy. Although I still miss her every day, I sometimes weep for joy at the thought of how happy Eileen must now be in heaven. And one day we shall meet again. But until then, there is still work for me to do down here. And that's the subject of our final talk. Till then, God bless you.